It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Paul Moist. He's the national president of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Canada's largest union with 605,000 members. I happen to have been one of those members for 37 years until I retired. And I was just talking to Paul a few minutes ago, and he is in his 37th year as a member of CUPE. So I guess, I don't know whether there's some forewarning there or some method we ought to take caution about. Somebody earlier today mentioned that I might still have a little time left. Paul is an advocate of education for public, advocate for public services. Moist has championed the positive role and vital role of services like healthcare, education, childcare play, and making our communities better places to live for all. Moist is a firm believer in the labor movement as a force for social change and has used his leadership to expand CUPE's work in literacy, combating climate change, improving the socioeconomic conditions of Aboriginal people, anti-racism, and gay rights advocacy. A longtime executive member of the Manitoba Federation of Labour, Paul served as a vice president of the Canadian Labour Congress. I think he still does, actually. A governor of the Labour College of Canada, and a vice president of Public Services International, the global body for public sector unions. Paul was first elected in 2003. Has always had a keen interest in labor history. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Manitoba, where he studied Canadian history and political science, and I can't talk. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, please welcome Paul Moist.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Dave, for that very kind introduction. It's a great privilege to be here on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Alberta Federation of Labour, and I want to congratulate Dave and all members of the Alberta Labour History Institute. You're setting the bar very high for other regions of Canada to not lose track of our history. And I want to thank Dave Coles, who agreed to a kind of change in the agenda because I'm not able to be here tomorrow. And lastly, but maybe most importantly, thank and acknowledge the women and men, past and present, who have made and continue to make labor history here in Alberta. So I speak to you, as Dave says, as a CUPE member since 1975, employee of the City of Winnipeg, where I'm still on leave from. As a graduate, I'm not qualified for my job any longer, so if I lose this job, I'm in trouble, but I still am an employee of the city. And as a graduate, as Dave says, of the University of Manitoba with a BA in Canadian history, which taught me a lot, but very little about Canadian labor history. And finally, as somebody in his 30th year of full-time union work, having worked as a national representative and a negotiator for CUPE, a local union leader in Winnipeg, civic employees in Winnipeg, and for the past 9 years as national president of CUPE. And my work has taken me many times to every corner of Canada and frankly around the globe to see the global dimensions of what the labor force is facing. In places like Grand Falls, Windsor, which Dave Coles may talk about tomorrow, and in Shenzhen, China, where we met with workers afraid to meet with us in secret, with guards posted, so members of the state union or government wouldn't catch us meeting with injured workers in China. So all of my studies, all of my experiences at work, my experiences as a Labor Council president, as a member of my Federation executive for 20 years, as a CLC executive member, a member of my global union, all of them have taught me that understanding our past is one of the only ways to prepare for our future. And I learned as chair in 1994 of the 75th anniversary of the 1919 strike in my hometown of Winnipeg, that on the 75th anniversary, Winnipeggers could and would speak about the general strike. In 1950, a council motion to commemorate the strike in 1969, the 50th anniversary, passed by one vote, a very acrimonious debate, and Labor's attempt to have celebrations in Winnipeg in 1969 failed. All those who had participated in the strike, it was kind of like returning veterans from the war. They did not and would not talk about it. So Winnipeg couldn't celebrate 1919 in 1969. They could in 1994, and much history, and history still is being revealed about that seminal struggle, which I'll speak about in a moment. But looking back at past struggles, I would argue, and how they unfolded, is not a barometer of how today's struggles will unfold. Jason Foster argues in the book that commemorates the 100th anniversary of the AFL, Working People in Alberta, there is indeed a new normal, as he calls it, at play today. But the past, our history, does have many lessons. Some are painful, some are inspiring, and all are important. And I'll just share a few with you and maybe spawn some dialogue within and amongst us. The first was, I was thinking earlier this year, Dave contacted me a year ago about this, and I've been thinking about it since then. And earlier this year in Flint, Michigan, they celebrated the 75th anniversary of the famous sit-down strike, the 44-day strike by GM workers over union recognition, and a strike they won, a strike that inspired factory workers, including auto workers, to do the same elsewhere in the United States coming out of the Great Depression. Inspired people to organize and to fight for better pay and working conditions. And at the time in Flint and throughout the United States and beyond the United States, the Flint workers were heroes. They inspired a generation of workers emerging from the Depression to demand more, using a variety of devices, including occupying the plant and sitting down from their tools over the issue of union recognition. I fast forward to the greatest economic downturn in North America since the 1930s, and the Canadian and U.S. government decisions to offer bailouts to GM and Chrysler. Ford said no in 2009, arising out of the 2008 recession. It was a stimulus move designed to save jobs and to, quote, save the industry in North America. And it worked, I would argue, to some degree, and it was manifestly unpopular on both sides of the border. Saving auto jobs was not at all popular with either the Canadian or the U.S. public. So why not? What changed between 1937 and 2009? Why were the workers 75 years ago in Flint not viewed as greedy and selfish, but they were viewed as heroes in sitting down and demanding union recognition? But auto workers were kind of denounced, or certainly it wasn't popular to save auto jobs in 2009. Second example, the story of immigrant labor in our country. Some of it captured in your history book for the AFL. The story of Canada's railways is the story of immigrant labor and struggle. The late Dick Martin, president of my Federation of Labor before he moved on from Manitoba to the CLC, talked about the as of yet unwritten history about the building of the railway to Churchill, our important or then important northern port, an untold story of countless, we don't know today how many workers, most of them immigrant, died on the job, unnoticed and unrecognized in building that railway. Like much of Canada's labor history, that hasn't been written about. But in your history book, Working People in Alberta, we talk about the CPR and other railways turning to an immigrant labor force, hoping for a more compliant workforce. Labor legislation emerged, as we heard with one of the presenters earlier in this room, in Alberta, after 30 years of struggle in places like Lethbridge, the coal banks dispute, 1906, we just heard in the previous workshop, the United Mine Workers' 9-month strike for union recognition. Here in Alberta and nationally through Mackenzie King's 1907 Industrial Disputes Investigation Act, these things arose out of these struggles. So this was an exploited worker in building railways in Canada who didn't benefit much, but these pieces of labor legislation were positive and forward-looking compared to what had existed. Fast forward to today, and I believe the federal budget may have been adopted or it will be adopted later today. So that today, or I guess when the Senate proclaims it, as they surely will, temporary foreign workers in Canada will have less rights this week than they had last week here in Canada. There's been an explosion, as you know, and Canada history is replete with examples of immigrant and foreign labor. But today, temporary foreign workers, 280,000 last year, far outpacing regular immigration to our country. They have less rights today, or whenever this budget is adopted, than they had a day ago, and more rights have been given to employers. Most of the temporary foreign workers, as they have been historically, non-union, employers holding all of the cards, government forcing workers to pay into programs such as employment insurance, but they're barred by law from claiming benefits that they pay for. And the current federal budget plans to legislate the right for employers to pay 15% below industry norms in terms of wages. Just a gift in the 480-page budget document. Mr. Kenney has actually argued, he hasn't done this yet, we should scrap the regular immigration list for Canadians. You pay $300 and you line up to be interviewed to come into the country. It's an 8-year waiting list right now. Tens of thousands of people from around the world are on the list. And he proposed publicly a few weeks ago to scrap the list and focus on improving the temporary foreign workers program. As of the Senate adopting this budget, we've also removed, they have less rights today than they had yesterday, people seeking refugee status in Canada were provided with basic health care services in the event they needed them by the state, and that is gone as of this budget. So, and then on the West Coast, in Ontario recently, in Hampstead, Ontario, 11 lives lost in a van without seatbelts, Peruvian workers working as temporary foreign workers in an agricultural setting in Ontario. So today, temporary foreign workers remain unorganized, exploited, and the fastest growing segment of the labor force in Canada. And Mr. Kenney wants to streamline the process to 10 days or less so employers can move this type of labor into Canada more quickly. That's labor force development in 2012 in one of the most advanced nations on the planet. So where on earth are we headed when it comes to immigrant labor in Canada in 2012? Who supports these workers? Who speaks on behalf of their plight? Which politicians are prepared to step forward and use precious time in legislatures or the House of Commons to speak about their situation? A third example, there's much talk today about a geopolitical shift in Canada with the resource-rich West, where we're having this conference, having replaced Ontario and Quebec as the engine of the Canadian economy. The West has not always been wanting in, if I can use that phrase. At the turn of the last century, my hometown, Winnipeg, was the third largest city in Canada. It was the Chicago of the North. Its population tripled between 1895 and 1907. Some talked of the city of 1 million, which never came to pass. It's smaller than Edmonton is today. The Panama Canal had a lot to do with killing that dream. So too, I would argue, did 6 weeks in Winnipeg in May and June of 1919. It killed another dream, a dream of organizing workers along industrial lines as opposed to craft lines, emerging out of a conference held in Calgary in early 1919, the so-called One Big Union. At its height, the Winnipeg General Strike saw 35,000 workers on the street, about half of whom were non-union workers. They walked out in support of metal trades workers seeking bargaining rights, bargaining recognition. In that same 6-week period, about 150,000 workers took part in 428 sympathy actions and strikes across Canada, including here in Edmonton. So my question, 90 some odd years later, what drove this level of solidarity? Workers did not succumb to the mainstream media reports that what was really going on in Winnipeg was a Bolshevik uprising, was workers trying to supplant the state, driving around streets in Winnipeg with signs that they would deliver milk by authority of the strike committee. Why did workers not buy that view of the state? The 1919 general strike was about union recognition and collective bargaining rights, and the strikers of the day knew that. The historical record, 9 decades later, affirms that. But that wasn't the reason business reacted so wildly to the 1919 strike, and they sent a message far beyond the boundaries of Winnipeg, I would argue. The cost of living in Manitoba, and similarly across Canada, between 1914 and 1919 had soared. For building trades workers, their wages had gone up about 13% over that period, less than a quarter of what inflation had gone up during the war years, creating a lot of pent-up demand on the part of workers who had watched Winnipeg civic workers strike and win in 1918. So fast forward to today, and I'm going to go back and forth between today and that time in Winnipeg. Real wages have not grown in Canada in a quarter century, apart from some isolated examples. There's huge downward pressure on wages today, brought about by public sector austerity and by globalization. How does labor fashion a collective response today? It seems to me that 9 decades ago in Winnipeg, there was more belief in the legitimacy of a collective response than exists today amongst unionized workers and between and amongst non-union and union workers. The OBU was, in my view, the dream of the Canadian workers to deal with what Jason Foster argues in your new book commemorating your 100th anniversary. Foster calls today's labor movement a divided labor movement. He argues in part that is what today's new normal is, at least in an Alberta context. I suspect he's talking farther than Alberta. Strangely, the unity and common purpose of Winnipeg workers in 1919 cannot mask the failure of that strike to achieve its goals, which ultimately, in my view, contributed to the end of the OBU as a viable organizing strategy before it had a chance to get off its feet. Some OBU locals lasted until the late 40s. The last one in Winnipeg was gone in 1948, Civic Waterworks workers. But this was not the belief in Calgary in early 1919. This was a viable idea for workers to organize along industrial lines, to have no competition amongst workers from different unions. That got smashed in Winnipeg. The Winnipeg business elite used the federal government to bypass Winnipeg City Council and the jurisdiction of note. The provincial government had jurisdiction over the events going on in Winnipeg. They were bypassed and sidelined by the business community, aided and abetted by the federal government. A private prosecution initiated by business. Many don't know that the prosecutions and the ultimate jailing of strike leaders was a private initiative. No charges were ever laid by any governmental authority, civically, provincially, or federally. The federal government paid for the private prosecution initiated by Winnipeg business from a fund marked for assistance for returning soldiers from the Great War. And Reinhold Kramer and Tom Mitchell, principally Tom Mitchell, spent many, many years from Brandon University, where he works, filing access for information requests. We now know where the money came from, $250,000 paid to Winnipeg lawyers, the Winnipeg business community, to prosecute strike leaders. That's about $2.6 million in today's dollars. And the lead prosecutor, a private lawyer, A.J. Andrews, made in 1920 triple what the Prime Minister made $45,000. And Winnipeg's ruling elite knew there was no Bolshevik uprising going on. They knew that at the time. They knew the strike leaders were mostly British-born. Militants, yes, but not seeking to overturn the system. In fact, the strike leaders played within the system. 4 of them ran for the Manitoba legislature from their prison cells and were elected. A fifth just came close, but he didn't quite make it. Winnipeg's business elite, in fact, did more to assume the powers of the state than any worker did in the streets of Winnipeg in 1919. What they wanted then, and I would argue that they seek now, is a couple of things. 1, to win at any cost, and 2, to never let an opportunity go by to send a message to workers in a wide scope, not just the workers in the particular dispute. The general strike leaders were prosecuted to make an example of them and to send a message to other prospective union leaders in Western Canada and elsewhere. Think about Vale Inco today. Think about Caterpillar, Rio Tinto, US Steel. They're all examples of strong unions in Canada, great unions, being taken on and having concessions imposed by them by global corporations who are strong. In the case of Vale Inco, its Canadian operations in Sudbury and in Voisey's Bay were less than 5% of its global revenue. It's bigger than most countries on the planet in terms of its global revenues. Vale Inco wasn't talking to Sudbury workers or just workers in Newfoundland and Labrador. They were talking to their workforce throughout the world. Your pension plan doesn't fit our corporate model for Vale Inco, and it won't be allowed to continue. And that message is being sent to other workers in Sudbury, other workers in Newfoundland and Labrador. So just like Winnipeg in 1919, there's the dispute at hand. There's the necessity on the part of business, today, global businesses, to send messages not just to the workers on the street, but to workers far and wide. So I ask, was the business response in 1919 any different than we're seeing today in Wisconsin, for example? Governor Walker raised over $30 million, most of it out of state, and outspent the labor movement by $12 to 1, and beat back his recall last week. The subsequent renderings of history regarding the 1919 strike by the Robson Commission and others was that the strike was not about imposing a new social order. It was about wages and working conditions. But having that proclaimed by the Robson Commission years after the strike is of little other than historical significance, because the workers of the day were smashed. The business community smashed the strike. They were aided and abetted by the federal government. And they sent a message, in my opinion, that went far beyond the city of Winnipeg. Union density fell in the 1920s in Manitoba. The 1930s saw the pain of massive unemployment without a pan-Canadian social safety net and very little in terms of union density in our country. As we just heard in the workshop earlier, Andrea Samuel argued the post-war compromise saw wages grow in real terms and social wages advance and union density increase, largely due to the organizing of the public sector. But the period since the 70s, economics, neoliberalism, and globalization have dictated austerity and both individual and social wage cuts across the board in developed nations. Union density rates are on the decline in Canada and in most of the developed world. Not all, but most. The latest mass protests, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Quebec student strike, see labor as supportive, but not as the catalyst for these uprisings. Different than Winnipeg in 1919, or different than other historical examples from Canada, the United States, and Europe. Labor was at the center of labor disputes, but much broader social disputes. It doesn't seem to me to be the case today. There are links between the labor movement and the Occupy Wall Street movements and the Quebec students movements, but labor as a catalyst, in my view, it's not there. And we have to question why not as a movement. The bottom line for me is that capital's power structures have always challenged labor's right to exist, saying things like, if you heard anything like this of late, quote, unions were good at one time, but they've outlived their usefulness. That was the Toronto Globe and Mail on May the 6th, 1886. So my own view, and my thoughts aren't conclusive on this, but as somebody living in these times and the last 30 years of our movement, we live today in a time of unlimited capacity to communicate, to receive and dispense information. Yet I'd argue we've never been less informed, less conscious of our class as workers than at this moment. Technology has the incredible ability to unite and inform. it can also isolate workers and others. As Havel said in Czechoslovakia, remember he was under house arrest in October 1989, in the streets of Prague in November of 1989, elected president of the Czech Republic in December, and he spoke to the country on January 1st, 1990. And he said, "We live in the postmodern world where anything is possible and nothing is certain." Maybe Bill Pritchard, one of the general strike leaders, he was from BC, but he was in Winnipeg throughout, was right when he told the jury in 1920, this is the title of the Manitoba Federation of Labor history book published about 25 years ago. The last words of this sentence are the title of that book. "The great appear great to us because we're on our knees. Let us rise." And he was speaking to a jury of his peers, I guess, about his view of what the labor movement faced in that city, in that context, in that dispute 90 years ago, which remains, I would argue, the greatest challenge to the labor movement today. It's not any employer that we deal with, in my view, as challenging as employers can be. It's not any government as challenging as they can be. Our greatest challenge is in our own discussions with ourselves as workers and our ability to communicate with each other, which is why, in my view, we need to keep telling our stories. They matter. We'll lose them if we don't embrace them. This is the key contribution, in my view, that the Alberta Labor History Institute is making here this week, setting the bar, I hope, for the rest of the country to embrace capturing our history. And to that extent, Dave and his team deserve our undying thanks. Thanks very much.